Today we're going to be multiplying radical expressions. What you need to know about multiplying radical expression is that anything that's under the square root can be multiplied together and then simplified. Everything that is outside of the square root can be multiplied together. So here we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 6. Both of those are under the square root sign, so we can multiply them together, and that would give us 18. We can simplify the square root of 18 by thinking of two factors, one of which is a perfect square. So I think of 9 times 2 is 18. 9 is a perfect square. I can take the square root of 9, which is 3. So my final answer would be 3 root 2. 3 times the square root of 2. Here we have 5 times the square root of 3 squared, which is the same thing as 5 root 3 times 5 root 3. Remember, we can multiply everything outside the square root sign times each other, and everything underneath can be multiplied together. So first on the outside, you'll notice that we'll have a 5 times 5, and underneath the radical sign, we have 3 times 3. So 5 times 5 is 25 on the outside, and the square root of 3 times 3 results in the square root of 9, and we can take the square root of 9, which is 3. So now we have to go 25 times 3, which is 75. On the outside of this, we have 2 times the square root of 8x times the square root of 4x. On the outside of the radical sign, we only have a 2. Underneath, we have 8x times 4x. We can multiply the 8 times the 4, and we can multiply the x times the x underneath. That is going to result in 32x squared. Again, we need to simplify. So first we have the number 32, which is not a perfect square. So we try to think of two factors where one of them would be a perfect square. And I can think of 2 and 16. So I broke 32 into square root of 16 times the square root of 2. Now, what can I take the square root of? What is a perfect square? I can take the square root of 16, which would be 4. And I can take the square root of x squared, which is be half of that. You always half it. On the outside, we have 2 times 4 times x. And underneath, we still have the square root of 2 because it's not a perfect square. The last step is we just want to simplify what's outside of the radical sign. 2 times 4x is 8x. And that leaves the square root of 2 underneath. When you have one term multiplied by two terms, we have to do the distributive property. So first we want to do the square root of 2 times 5, which would be 5 root 2. And then we have the square root of 2 times the square root of 12. When we multiply those, we have 5 root 2. And then I can break the 12 down into two factors. 4 times 3. 4 times 3 results in 12. 4 is a perfect square. So now I can take the square root of 4, which is 2. 4, square root of 2. So now if you look at the first term, we had 5 root 2. Now in the second term there, we've pulled the 2 out, so we have 2. And underneath, we have 3 times 2, which is left, because both of these are not perfect squares. So they stay underneath. And when we simplify that, we would have 5 root 2 plus 2 root 6. We learned in our lesson about adding and subtracting with radicals that we can only add these together if the radicals are the same. If we have like terms, they are not. So that is simplified as far as it can go. Again, we have the distributive property here. So with the first one, we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. Then we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 5. The square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 9. And 3 times 5 is 15. So now we have to see if we can simplify these. 9 is a perfect square, so we can take the square root of that, which is 3. 15 does not have two factors where one of them is a perfect square, so it is simplified as far as it can go. So our final answer is simply 3 minus the square root of 15. When you have two terms times two terms, we're going to use the distributive property twice, also called FOIL. So in this first one, we're going to take 4 and we're going to multiply it times the first and second terms in the second one. It's called first terms, outer terms. Then we're going to multiply the inner terms and the last terms. We're doing the distributive property twice. When we do that, we have 4 times 3 for the first terms minus 4 times the square root of 5. For the inner terms, we have 3 root 5. And for the outer terms, we have the square root of 5 times the square root of 5. We can begin simplifying now. And we know that 4 times 3 is 12. And here we have two like terms. We could go ahead and simplify that if we would like to. Since they are like terms, I can take the negative 4 and the positive 3 and add them together, which is a negative 1. The 1 can be invisible, so I have negative root 5 minus the square root of 25. 25 happens to be a perfect square, so I can take the square root of 25, which is 5. And now that it's pulled out of the square root sign, if we've taken the square root of it, we have to multiply it times what other terms we have here. So we would have 7 minus the square root of 5. I think I said multiply them, and I said that in error. What we have here is you have to subtract them, because we have 12 minus 5. Okay, let's practice FOIL again. So if we do our first terms, we have 3 times 8. Then we have 3 times square root of 3, and that has a negative in front of it. Then we have the square root of 3 times 8, and then we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. It looks like this. That's when I do my FOIL. Now let's see what we can do to simplify. 3 times 8 is 24, so I can simplify that. Here we have like terms, so I can do the positive 8 plus the positive 3, which is a positive 5, root 3. Here's my 24 for the first term. That was a positive. And then the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 9. And we know that the square root of 9 is 3, so we have minus 3. Now we can do 24 minus 3, which is going to result in 21. Plus 5 root 3. Here we have the square root of 7 minus 5 squared. So we have, that means the same thing as the square root of 7 minus 5 times the square root of 7 minus 5. First terms is square root of 7 times the square root of 7. And we know that that results in the square root of 49, which is just 7. Now let's do the outer terms. Square root of 7 times negative 5 is a negative 5 root 7. Now we do the inner terms. We have negative 5 times square root of 7, which is again negative 5 root 7. And then we have negative 5 times a negative 5, which is a positive 25. Here in the center, we have like terms, like radicals. So we can do a negative 5 times a negative 5 plus a negative 5, which is a negative 10 root 7. And then we can combine our 7 and our 25 together. And our final answer would be 32 minus 10 root 7. The important thing to remember is that you can multiply everything outside the radical sign. You can multiply everything that's underneath the radical sign together. And then it's just a matter of